the back? Yes, great. I'm Marjolein Kars, and I'm the new chair of the history department, and I'm honored to introduce today's speaker, John McNeil from Georgetown University, and to welcome you all to this year's Webb lecture, which is sponsored by the history department and by the Drescher Center for the Humanities. The annual Webb lecture brings a prominent historian of European or sometimes British history to UMBC every fall, and the lecture is named in remembrance, or in honor, because he's still alive, of Professor Emeritus Bob Webb, who was an historian of Britain and whose leadership at UMBC really can't be overstated. He came to UMBC already a distinguished historian in 1975, and while he was here, he played a role in almost every aspect of the university's life, including several stints as chair of the history department, and he was also acting vice chancellor for academic affairs, which is what we now call the provost. Among his many awards are 2 Guggenheims, a Fulbright, fellowships from NEH and ACLS, and in 1989 UMBC named him a distinguished presidential research professor to recognize his world-class scholarship and his many contributions to the historical profession. He was, for instance, the editor of the American Historical Review for many, many years. So the department continues to honor Bob Webb with the Webb Lecture every year, and we're very sorry that Professor Webb could not be here this year. He's getting older and doesn't do nearly as much traveling. So this year's Webb lecturer is Professor John McNeil from Georgetown. He was born and raised in Chicago, and he explains on his website that he remains a passionate fan of Chicago sports teams. I was trying to figure out how good they are, and I'm not entirely sure. He received his BA from Swarthmore and his PhD from Duke. That's really the main reason we invited him, because we have so many Dukies in the history department. He taught briefly at Goucher after he finished up at Duke, and then he became a professor at Georgetown, where he currently holds a chair as university professor both in the history department and in the School of Foreign Service, correct? His website states that he lives a, quote, agreeably harried existence with his triathlete wife and their 4 exuberant children, and that if he had time, he would really enjoy hiking, tennis, basketball, and travel. But if you look at Professor McNeil's curriculum vitae, which is about the length of a short book, it becomes clear that it's not just the wife and the 4 children that keep him from getting enough exercise, because he has an absolutely amazing publication record in environmental history, in international history, and in world history. He has published 5 monographs and 8 edited books so far. And I'm just going to give you the titles of 2 of them to give you a sense of his range. His monographs include a book published by Norton and later put out in paperback by Penguin in 2000 called Something New Under the Sun, an environmental history of the 20th century world, which made the Times of London's list of best science books ever written. And the book that he will talk about today, which I brought a copy of to hold up, but I don't know what I did with it, is called Mosquito Empires, Ecology and Warfare in the Greater Caribbean, 1620 to 1914. So that really deals more with the early modern world, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2010. Like all of Professor McNeil's books, Mosquito Empires won a slew of prizes, including the Beveridge Award from the American Historical Association, which is given each year to the best book that deals with the history of the Americas. And all of his books have been translated into dozens of languages from around the world. He's currently writing a book that's going to be published by Harvard University Press titled The History of the Anthropocene. Am I pronouncing that right?
There are 2 plausible pronunciations, and that is one of them.
I had to look up the term, okay, and I'm going to explain it to you. Wikipedia, I thought I'd consult something you would all be familiar with. Wikipedia defines Anthropocene as a, quote, recent and informal geological, chronological term that serves to mark the existence and extent of human activities that have had a significant global impact on the Earth's ecosystems. The term was popularized by Nobel Prize-winning atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen, who regards the influence of human behavior on the Earth's atmosphere in recent centuries as so significant as to constitute a new geological era. So I'm sure that Professor McNeil can explain this to you better, and you might even be able to ask him questions about global warming. In addition to his books and edited volumes, Professor McNeil has written more than 100 articles, essays, and chapters, and then there are what he calls his occasional pieces. His work has been honored with every prize under the sun, including a Guggenheim, a Woodrow Wilson Center Fellowship, a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, and several Fulbrights, and he has been invited to lecture all over the world. I have a little bit of personal experience with Professor McNeil's formidable intellect and incisive critical abilities because I attend a seminar in early modern history at Georgetown, and whenever John McNeil shows up, which is not that often, but when he does, I notice that everybody in the room sits up a little straighter, and they try a little harder, and the person giving the paper slides down a little further in their chair. So we are absolutely delighted that Professor Neil could be here today, and his lecture, which really expands our notion of agency in history to include the female mosquito, and that's the female part that is really delightful. It's titled Mosquito Empires and Revolutionary Fevers in the Greater Caribbean, 1600 to 1900. So please join me in welcoming Professor John McNeil.
Don't believe everything you hear. Dr. Kars is, I'm sure, normally a responsible and 100% reliable soul. However, you need to discount what she has said by at least 50% in order to get a proper appreciation of today's speaker. Thank you to Dr. Kars and Dr. Bowling for inviting me to UMBC this afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here, an honor to be here, and thanks to all of you for turning up on a gorgeous autumn afternoon when there are lots of other interesting things that you could be doing. I am indeed going to speak about mosquitoes and fevers over the next 35 or 45 minutes, and after that you ask me questions about anything you like, from the fortunes of Chicago sports teams to global warming or the habits of mosquitoes, and I'll do my best to answer. Now, I'm going to begin by explaining how I got interested in mosquitoes and fevers, and this takes me back to my days as a graduate student at Duke University, where there were magnificent undergraduates in my day, some of them in the hall this afternoon. I, unfortunately, was, for quite some time, exiled to places like southern Spain, doing research in buildings like this one here, the Archivo General de Indias, where I spent 8 cold and miserable months researching a PhD dissertation that only 3 professors and 1 member of my family have ever read. While I was doing that important work, I kept running into references to epidemics and outbreaks of yellow fever on the island of Cuba, which was part of the focus of my justly neglected doctoral dissertation. And I didn't do much with those epidemics, but I thought it was an interesting issue. Maybe one day I would return to it. And then my life veered in different directions. I got a job teaching European history at Goucher, and I stopped thinking about Cuba. Then I got a job at Georgetown and was too busy with teaching things that I knew absolutely nothing about in order to pay attention to any scholarship, at least for a while. But then one day, I was walking through the library at Georgetown, and I pulled a book off the shelf because it had an interesting looking title, Black Dust Jacket, and I opened the book up, and chapter 2 was by me. It was a conference paper I had given and completely forgotten about at Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And it was about mosquitoes and yellow fever. And so I scurried back to my office and entered this on my curriculum vitae. And thought, I didn't do such a hot job with this subject. I need to do it properly. So other things got in the way. It took me better part of 20 years actually to return to it. But between 2003 and 2009, this is what I was doing. I was consumed by mosquitoes, not in the literal sense, but in an intellectual sense. And that is the journey from Seville, the Archivo General de Indias, to the subject that I'll be speaking about now. And I will be speaking about a region that I call, and this is not original with me, the Greater Caribbean. And what it means is a zone of the Americas where the slave plantation was the principal institution of economic life, and where, this is the important part for my story, where it was warm enough, humid enough for certain kinds of mosquitoes to prosper, where there were dense populations of humans for mosquitoes to feed upon, and where there were lots of ports, that's connected to the slave plantation economy, because that was an export economy, primarily of sugar. Lots of ports ensuring the circulation of people and mosquitoes. So that's what the Greater Caribbean is. It extends from the Chesapeake, i.e. right around here, south to the northern shores of the continent of South America. And this is approximately what I'll be trying to walk through this afternoon. I'll give a little outline of the argument that structures my ideas. I'll say a little bit about diseases and mosquitoes, especially for those of you who are studying biology. And then I'll get into the historical heart of the matter. And please note some of the things that I'm doing less overtly, but to my mind, importantly. I'm going to be speaking about mosquitoes and plasmodia and viruses, but I'm also addressing classical concerns of historians from the time of Thucydides onward. Empires, revolutions, warfare. And I'm going to try to present some reasonably familiar stories of empires, revolutions, and warfare in a different light, informed by ecological and epidemiological considerations. And I'm also doing something else less overtly, which is lumping together stories of revolutions that are normally considered separately. And they have something in common, which I'll explain to you, which, to my way of thinking, makes them a useful unit, even if historians typically consider them separately. And in E, here you can see where I'm going to take you. So here is the bold and bald summary of the argument that structures my remarks. I feel a terrible temptation to walk around, but I guess I shouldn't. I'm looking at the fellow with the earphones on, and he's nodding. I shouldn't walk around too much. He shucks. So part one is the proposition that this region was subject to environmental change. It was ecologically modified as a result of the plantation economy in such a way as to make it more hospitable to disease-bearing mosquitoes and more hospitable to the pathogens themselves, particularly the yellow fever virus, that spark diseases. And I'll be arguing further that this situation, the ecological modification and the greater presence of these diseases, created a situation which I summarize with the term differential immunity or differential resistance, in which some people, by virtue of where they were born and raised and what diseases they survived in childhood, were more resistant, in some cases totally immune to deadly infection, whereas other people, born and raised elsewhere, were highly susceptible and their lives put at great risk when they walked into the greater Caribbean. And I'll be arguing that this differential immunity was an important factor in making wars of revolution successful wars between 1770 and 1898. That'll be the bulk of the presentation. And throughout, I'm trying to convince you that there is an arena, a legitimate arena of historical inquiry where natural variables and cultural variables interact in ways that can be really complicated, but can still be explored. And in so doing, I'm going to be dealing with what I like to call the dark matter of history. Those of you who pay attention to astronomy know that astrophysicists believe that the universe is packed with stuff they can't see. They call it dark matter. It's not detectable with any instruments, but they think, they know it's there because of its effect on, its observable effects on observable phenomena. And I could get into greater detail, but not much greater detail, about this phenomenon of dark matter. But the metaphor is that in history too, there are things that we can't directly observe. The mosquitoes and the viruses didn't leave any memoirs. But I think we can be pretty sure that they were there and exercising some impact over things that we can observe that did leave some trace in documents and archives. So that's why I say wrestling with the dark matter in this particular inquiry of mine. So now a little bit about yellow fever, followed by a little bit about a particular mosquito. And I'll say something about malaria later on when I get to the case where malaria most mattered. So here's what you need to know about yellow fever. Get the vaccination. You do not want this disease. If you ever go to Amazonia or to West Africa or Central Africa, you are going to get the vaccination. It's a great vaccination. It works almost all the time. And the reason you want to get this is because this is an extremely lethal disease. Case mortality rates 30%, 50%, 80%. Documented in the historical record. So it's one of the most deadly human diseases that there is. The symptoms are really, many of them, disgusting, and I will not rehearse them except to say that it has one symptom that is distinctive, not totally unique to yellow fever, but distinctive. And this is important because it makes it easier for me and any other historians interested in yellow fever, there are about 3 of us on the planet, to conduct retrospective diagnosis and to be reasonably sure that a certain disease was yellow fever. That symptom is when you're about to die of yellow fever, you begin to vomit up partially coagulated blood, the color and consistency of coffee grounds. It's really slimy and gross beyond description. But it happens to be so distinctive that even untrained observers would remark upon it just about any time. So it left, therefore, an imprint in the historical record that most other diseases don't. Whether people would say somebody was sick, somebody had a fever, but you can't tell much from that. When people encountered yellow fever in the past and described this one symptom, it's very helpful to me. The disease is of West African origin, the virus. This used to be controversial until about 15 years ago, but genomic analysis has made it really clear that it's of West or West Central African origin. Presumably then it came to the Americas in the context of the slave trade. It did so by the 1640s, if not before. It probably came many times in the context of the slave trade, but it did not establish itself as endemic in the Americas, as far as we can tell, until the 1640s, when there was a big regional epidemic in the Caribbean that killed maybe a third of the population of that region. And it's carried by one and only one mosquito, Aedes aegypti. So that's what the virus looks like under an electron microscope. You can see a little bit about the symptoms. And the good thing about yellow fever, that's probably the only good thing about yellow fever, is that if you get it as a little kid, it's usually not all that serious. You can get it and not even know that you're sick. Your chances of survival are excellent, and you're probably immune, totally immune for life. There's no documented case of anybody ever getting yellow fever twice. So if you're going to get it as a toddler, get it over with. It's kind of like measles in this respect. Well, there's several viral diseases that are worse to get as adults than as little kids. Malaria, which I'll get to in due course, is the opposite. Don't get it as a little kid. I think you're all safe. You're not going to get it as a little kid. So this meant that in the Caribbean region, people who had been there a long time after the 1640s had already had yellow fever. If they were still alive, they were immune. Newcomers to the region, extremely susceptible. Men versus women. This is an interesting point. I've got some question marks surrounding this because the 17th and 18th century sources frequently say that men were more vulnerable, women more resistant to yellow fever. Modern medical literature says nothing of the sort. Actually doesn't say anything about it one way or the other. I don't think it was true. I think it's a matter of differential exposure rather than bodily resistance. But the 17th and 18th century sources thought generally differently, that there's something about female bodies that made them more resistant to yellow fever. And then there's another question about yellow fever, which is whether or not, in addition to conferred immunity, there might be heritable resistance or even heritable immunity. This is a controversial point. Modern medical literature says maybe. Let's do more research, but nobody's doing any research on yellow fever because it's not important enough nowadays. If there is, it is something that is characteristic of people of West or Central African origin. People from elsewhere in Africa are much less likely to have a long ancestral experience of yellow fever. And this is what you would need over hundreds of generations, regular exposure to produce, through evolution, resistance. And it may be that this exists for people of West or West Central African ancestry, but it may be that it doesn't. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence in the Americas suggesting people of African, really West and West Central African background are or have been more resistant to yellow fever, but it could be that this evidence just reflects inconsistencies in reporting or some other variables. Nobody really knows for sure. It doesn't actually matter that much for my ideas. That is the Aedes aegypti after having a nice tasty meal of blood. So now a few words about this lovely creature. All mosquitoes are temperature sensitive. This one likes temperatures above 85 Fahrenheit, below about 103 Fahrenheit to feel active, to fly and bite freely. It really likes to bite people. Mosquitoes are variable in this respect. There's about 4,000 different species identified of mosquitoes, and they're all different in terms of their feeding habits. The females all need blood in order to produce eggs. But where they get that blood is a matter of taste. This one has a strong preference for human blood.
But it will, in extremis, bite cattle and horses and pigs. But the preference, the so-called feeding focus, means it's a pretty efficient vector of disease because it doesn't often inject virus into pigs, which pigs just kill the virus. That's the end of the road for the virus. Instead, this mosquito is almost all the time biting humans, and so it's efficient as a vector. It has the strangest breeding habits of any mosquito anywhere on the face of the earth. Those are eggs laid by Aedes aegypti. Instead of laying its eggs in swamps and puddles, like most mosquitoes do, it has a powerful preference for artificial water containers, buckets, barrels, wells, cisterns, etc., or even plastic dishes. This is really weird, and it's hard to figure how it got this preference. Somewhere in the long history of pottery in West Africa, maybe, it found a niche that no other creatures were exploiting and began to lay its eggs in pots. It's the only mosquito that does this. And in a moment or two, I'll explain why that matters. It is therefore essentially a domesticated animal. It is found in the presence of human settlements and almost nowhere else, especially places where water is stored, which means ships, ports, and as you'll see, sugar plantations. In case you're worried, while in the 18th century it was pretty easy to get yellow fever in Baltimore in the summer months, it's really hard now. And you'd have to go to some of these places to get it, and you'd have to go to some of these places to encounter the mosquito, which also carries dengue, by the way. Not nearly as deadly as yellow fever, but really, really bad. I've had dengue, never had yellow fever. And you can see it's a fair piece from Baltimore, despite climate change that is making the United States ever more hospitable to Aedes aegypti. It's going to be a while before it's a permanent resident in the Baltimore area. But it's moving northward slowly. Okay, now I got to tell you how it is that the Caribbean became extra hospitable to Aedes aegypti. And that has to do, above all else, with the sugar plantation economy, which came into being in the 1620s, 30s, and 40s on the small islands, and later on the big islands of Jamaica, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Hispaniola. When sugar came, land had to be cleared to make room for sugar cane. That meant deforestation, lowering of bird populations, which reduced predation on all mosquitoes. I'm making this up, by the way. I had no way of doing censuses of birds in the 17th century, but there is some testimony in the texts. People who went to Barbados in 1627 went back in 1640 and said, hey, there are no birds left anymore. So I take that as an indication of a general pattern. So reduced predation is part, but only a small part of the story of making these regions into a mosquito paradise. The bigger part of it is creating ideal breeding conditions and feeding conditions. Mosquitoes like sweet fluids, all mosquitoes, male and female alike. That's all that male mosquitoes like to eat. Sugarcane is great. They can just stick their proboscis into sugarcane and get a nice drink. So their chances of survival on a sugar plantation are great because there's an essentially infinite supply of food for them. On top of that, there's a lot of blood for female mosquitoes to tap into in order to produce their eggs. A lot of human blood, because there's a lot of human beings on plantations, but if they run out of humans or somehow are misguided, they can bite livestock, because all sugar plantations had oxen and horses as well. Just gigantic quantities of big bags of blood on sugar plantations for female mosquitoes to help themselves too. And then, if that wasn't enough, Sugar plantations also had stored water in the routine ways, cisterns, wells, and so forth, but they also had pots used in the initial phases of sugar refining. And a big plantation would have 10,000 of these pots, used for 2 or 3 months every year in the harvest season, and other than that, just lying around, collecting rainwater in the rainy season. Aedes aegypti could not have asked for a better environment than this to maximize its populations. Ideal breeding, feeding, and predation conditions. Now, I don't actually know that mosquito populations increased after the 1640s. There's no archaeological evidence. Again, there's no censuses, just circumstantial evidence. Dark matter. Good enough for me. Not good enough for some historians, I think. So, after the 1640s, there's another big regional epidemic in the 1690s. By this time, yellow fever and the Aedes aegypti were always present in the region. And that helped to make the Spanish Empire much more stable than it otherwise could have been, because it was defended by people, militias generally, born and raised in the region and yellow fever resistant, also malaria resistant. People sent out to attack the Spanish Empire, British, French, Dutch, mostly British, on the other hand, came from backgrounds that did not equip their immune systems to cope with yellow fever. So there's enormous mortality associated with invasion attempts against the Spanish Empire, which I'm not going to talk about. Instead, I'm going to get to the revolutions, starting right around here with the American Revolution in the 1770s, and then going through this list. And everywhere, it's more or less the same story. Locally born and raised, people resistant, people from afar not resistant. So, those of you who are studying American history or even remember studying it in middle school probably recall that in the first few years of the war, a fairly stable stalemate evolved. Most of the campaigns were in the New York, New Jersey area, and by 1779 the British were in control of most of the important ports. The Continental Army and its militia sympathizers were in control of lots of the countryside, and neither could move the other out. But with time, the situation was growing increasingly awkward for both sides. They were running out of money. From the British point of view, they were prosecuting a war that was increasingly unpopular, that was increasingly international. The French joined against them, the Dutch, the Spanish. The war was now being fought in the Indian Ocean, in the Caribbean, in Europe itself, as well as on the Atlantic seaboard of North America. And from the British point of view, time was working against them. And so they took a big gamble. They decided to try to press the war to a conclusion with a so-called Southern strategy, which meant try to win over presumed loyalists in the Southern colonies, try to cut off the money of the Continental Army and the Continental Congress by interfering with the plantation economy, tobacco and rice for the main part. And that was the gamble that they took. And that obliged them to stick their biggest army into Mosquito terrain in the south. And they chose Charleston, South Carolina. That guy in the bottom right, one of their most capable officers, a very nasty piece of work, dropped out of law school and became a vicious killer and very successful cavalry officer, Banastre Tarleton. So here's the terrain into which they set foot at the very end of 1779, the South Carolina Low Country. From the point of view of the health of the British Army, this was the worst possible choice they could have made, because here malaria reigned supreme. This is a place where conditions are good for mosquitoes, have been good for mosquitoes since the last ice age, but they got better for malarial mosquitoes with the rice economy that was put into place beginning in the 1690s and increasingly in the subsequent decades. So the low country was diked and ditched with irrigation canals and seasonal flooding of rice fields every year. Ideal breeding conditions for the malarial mosquito, the Anopheles quadrimaculatus, of whom I'll say a little bit more. It was also a comparatively densely populated part of the eastern seaboard because of the slave plantation economy. Lots of people, i.e. bags of blood from the mosquito's point of view, lots of cattle as well, and the Anopheles, at least the quadrimaculatus, it likes humans, but it'll cheerfully bite cattle and horses, pigs as well. So this is the Anopheles quadrimaculatus. It's all over the place. It is in Baltimore, but fortunately for us, it's almost never carrying malarial plasmodia nowadays. Malaria, you can get again and again and again and again. In fact, once you get it, you basically never lose it. It's in your body for the rest of your life, and it may flare up from time to time, make you feel sick. But the more times you do feel sick, by and large, the more resistance your body will develop. You'll never be immune. It's different from the yellow fever infection in this respect. But you can build up resistance. And if you were born and raised in a malarial part of the world, whether it's the low country of South Carolina in the 18th century or Guinea-Bissau today, you're going to get malaria time and again, and you're going to get, over time, more resistant to it if you survive. So the population in South Carolina, everybody who'd made it to, let's say, military age, 16, 17 years old, had malaria 16 or 17 summers. And they were comparatively resistant. But the people in the British Army sent there had mainly came from the Scottish Highlands, from various parts of Germany. In American history we call them Hessians, but only a minority of them came from Hesse. Or from England. Very few of them had any malaria background, some of them did, but the great majority of them not. So they were maximally vulnerable, the local population strongly resistant. And every summer in the low country, and really throughout the South, including the Chesapeake, including the Baltimore area, every summer there were malaria outbreaks. Lots of people got sick, and a small proportion died, mainly little kids. You can see this in the seasonality of death in the Chesapeake, in which August, September, and October were much more lethal months than any others of the year. And that is a signature of a strong malaria presence. So when the British Army got to the low country of South Carolina, they took 5 months to take Charleston. If they'd been lucky, they would have grabbed it really fast and been able to campaign before summer came. But it didn't work out that way. It was May before they had taken Charleston, and they started campaigning in the summer months. Bad luck, bad news. They started to host their own private malaria epidemic because their people were much more vulnerable than everybody else in South Carolina. And this inhibited their mobility, because when lots of guys are too sick to move, you can't just leave them there and let the savages, i.e. militias of South Carolina, kill them all. You have to protect them. So their ability to move around was inhibited by the tremendous proportion, a third, a half, of their army that was sick in the summer months. Now, at the same time, this is a bit of a diversion, but I think it's interesting, and I hope you'll find it interesting. The Continental Army was suffering from the threat of smallpox. Outlined very nicely in a book that I recommend to you by Elizabeth Fenn, Pax Americana, published a few years ago. A really good piece of work, in my opinion. So the Continental Army was made up of a lot of people from backwoods locations, people who had never encountered smallpox in their lives. Smallpox is a crowd disease. People who live in large congregations are going to get it in childhood, and if they survive, they're immune for life. Just about everybody, not really everybody, not the Highland Scots necessarily, but almost everybody in the British Army was immune to smallpox. Comparatively few people in the Continental Army immune to smallpox. So in the early years of the war, smallpox was killing George Washington's soldiers at an appalling rate. He had a solution to this. It's called variolation. It's put a cut in your arm, rub a little bit of infected material in there, and hope that you get a tiny case of smallpox that immunizes you for life. 1 to 2% of cases, it kills you. But that was, from Washington's point of view, an acceptable risk. A lot of his troops didn't like it, but if they were going to be paid, they had to do it. The British had no comparable solution for their malaria problem, as I'll explain in just a moment. And these diseases, and diseases in general, I should say, killed people far faster than combat did in the American Revolution. This was true in all wars until the 20th century. But at least an order of magnitude more died from disease than from combat in the Revolution. So here's a few snippets of data. You can read them for yourself about the Continental Army's experience, especially in the Quebec campaign, and Washington's recognition of the importance of variolation. And he mandated it from early 1777 onward. And the British could not do anything comparable about malaria. There was only one thing people could do about malaria. There was a bark from a particular tree, cinchona tree, found only in the foothills of the Andes, South America. They could provide some protection against infection and also reduce the severity of the symptoms. But it was really expensive. And after Spain entered the war, it was more expensive because the Spanish controlled the supply in South America, and they had the good sense to make sure that the British couldn't get their hands on it, except through smuggling and contraband. So, and if the British did get their hands on it, it would first go to the Navy, and secondly to troops stationed in the East Indies or in the Caribbean. So those in the eastern seaboard of North America weren't going to get it except under the most extraordinary of circumstances. So after the siege of Charleston, campaigns began in South Carolina, and the British Army, if it wanted to stay healthy, had to go inland as far as possible to get away from the most intense malaria zone. But if they wanted to be supplied, they had to stay in the ports. Catch-22. And after a little bit, the Continental Army in the South was commanded by this guy, Nathaniel Greene, and his basic task was not to lose in one battle. Just keep the war going and let the British spend money that they increasingly didn't have and suffer from malaria. Oops, sorry about that. The British Army was commanded by Lord Cornwallis, a soldier of considerable experience. He recognized the malaria problem that his army had. He referred to it in this particular document. They fought a few battles, won some, lost some. Some of them are reckoned generally to be draws. A few hundred guys were killed on each occasion. It didn't matter very much. Cornwallis concluded after the summer and fall of 1780 that he couldn't spend another summer in this part of the world. His army would not survive intact as an army. So he decided on his own hook he was going to march north, out of South Carolina. They spent the late winter, that's the first few months of 1781, in Professor Bowling's hometown, Wilmington, North Carolina. And then as summer approached, he moved north. And part of his explanation for his choice, which was taken without consultation with his superiors, was to get out of the malarial zone, which was quite prudent. Unfortunately, his commanding officer told him to stop in Virginia at a place called Yorktown. And Cornwallis didn't like it very much, as you can see from that quotation. But there he was from late June of 1781 onward, with a little over 8,000 what was left of his army. They were cut off from the British Navy thanks to a sea battle, and when that happened, very famously, Washington and his French counterpart, General Rochambeau, marched south from New York and New England in a real hurry, and by the middle of September, they were there at Yorktown and laid siege to the British position. Siege lasted about a month. And in the course of that, only twice did Cornwallis do what everybody knew he should do to counteract a siege, which is every night you send some guys out to spike the guns of the besiegers and try to destroy the earthworks that they have built in the course of the last 24 hours. He did that twice, and I think he had 29 nights in which to do this. That's not because he didn't know what he was doing. He was well educated in the military arts. He was experienced in siege warfare, and he had a very distinguished career after Yorktown. So, patriotic rendering of the surrender. Here's what he said the day after he surrendered. He wrote a long letter trying to cover his rear end, but several times in this letter he referred, and it's in yellow, the pieces I really want you to read, referred to sickness in his army, preventing him from doing what he knew he needed to do in order to resist the siege, hold out a little bit longer in hopes that the British Navy could rescue him. The British Navy showed up 5 days after the surrender. So if he could have held out a little longer, the history of the American Revolution might have turned out rather differently than it did. But he gave up October 19th. You might wonder, but if you've been paying close attention, you wouldn't wonder all that much, why the Continental Army didn't get equally sick. Most of its guys came from southern colonies. A lot of them came from the Chesapeake area, actually, Maryland and Delaware regiments. The French, and there were a lot of French present at Yorktown, many of them had served for a couple of years in the Caribbean and probably had some malaria resistance, although that's just guesswork on my part. In any case, a lot of the French and the Continental Army troops from New England did get sick. Fortunately for them, after Cornwallis had already surrendered, so it didn't matter. They'd only gotten there in September. The British Army had been there all summer, absorbing malarial plasmodia with bite after bite of Anopheles quadrimaculatus. That was a huge difference in their health experience. So, case number one, and the subsequent cases I'm going to work through more rapidly, the American Revolution. Southern strategy had this fatal flaw in it, the vulnerability of the British Army to malaria, and the fear of malaria that inhibited the choices available to the British Army. A justifiable fear, and there was nothing they could do about it. Now, case number two, the Haitian Revolution, in which malaria was present, but yellow fever was the, by far, most important infection. So, in September of 1791, in the context of the French Revolution breaking out across the ocean, a slave rising, the biggest slave revolt in the history of the world, began in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, what we now call Haiti. And interestingly enough, it was the British who tried to occupy and control this slave rising. They didn't want to have a slave revolution in the Caribbean either, and they had more wherewithal to deal with it because the French had their hands full with a revolution, and by 1793 lots of wars on the continent. So the British sent an expedition to occupy Saint-Domingue in 1793, and one of their doctors said, don't do it, two-thirds of the soldiers are gonna die within a year, which was not entirely right. It took 5 years, but two-thirds of the British Army did die from disease in the course of that occupation, and they gave up in 1798. And a couple of years later, they were followed by a huge French expedition organized and commanded by Napoleon's brother-in-law, pictured here on the right, with 50 to 65,000 troops. The numbers they came in installments. The numbers are a little bit uncertain. And they too fought against this slave rising, tried to reinstate slavery in the colony. And they lost, as you can read, about 1,000 men to combat and upwards of 50,000 to disease, in the great majority of cases, yellow fever. They were fighting against forces that in the until 1803 were commanded by this guy, who also led the fight against the British, Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint is interesting in many respects. I think he's extra interesting because I think he understood how to use yellow fever in his campaigns. I say this on the strength of the way he fought his campaigns. It's classic guerrilla strategy, could have had other motives. Also because of two documents in his captured correspondence, one of which is quoted here, and I'll translate that for you in a moment. He was attentive to matters of health. As a slave, he had been an animal veterinarian, especially responsible for horses. He had worked in a Jesuit hospital, also as a slave, and when the rising began in 1791, he designated himself in his correspondence, he knew how to write, as médecin général, sort of surgeon general of the slave army. These are snippets of evidence that lead me to suppose he was especially attuned to matters of health, and therefore more likely to see how he could use that to his advantage. So what he wrote in 1802 to one of his lieutenants was that in waiting for the rainy season, and I have a typo in there, I apologize, which will rid us of our enemies, we have as tools only destruction and fire. It's the first clause that really matters. In waiting for the rainy season that will rid us of our enemies. He understood that the rainy season, it's the mosquito season, and the yellow fever season was going to kill large numbers of the French army, as indeed it did. My third case, mainly in Venezuela. When, in the context of the Napoleonic Wars, the French invaded Spain in 1807, maybe it was 1808, I forget. A lot of people in Spanish America took advantage of the situation to form juntas, try to advance the cause of their own power, and often this meant to seek political independence from Spain, which was then run by the French. And one of Napoleon's brothers was in charge. And in Venezuela, a war of independence resulted, which was fought along the northern coasts of Venezuela, good yellow fever terrain, and also fought in the interior grasslands, seasonally inundated grasslands called the Llanos, which are excellent malaria country. It's now, still today, the most malaria-infested part of South America. And it was full of livestock in 1808, most of which was slaughtered in the course of the war, meaning that, and I'm making this up too, the mosquitoes, which used to have lots of livestock to feed on, had far fewer mammals to choose from, focusing their efforts on people, maximizing the efficiency of the circulation of malarial plasmodium. So that in the Llanos, malaria was an extreme risk. On the coast, yellow fever was a high risk. And this meant that the Spanish army sent out to restore Venezuela to Spain, and it came several years after 1808, it came in 1815, was at acute risk of both of those diseases. It was under the command of this guy, Pablo Murillo, a pacifier, as he liked to be called. He was, of course, anything but. And he brought an army of about 17,000 men, almost all of whom died, very few of whom ever made it home. Very few of them died in combat. The great majority of them 90%, 93% of them died from disease. I don't really know in most cases what disease that was, but there's probably lots of diseases. But yellow fever and malaria were prominent among them. And Murillo seemed to recognize what was going on. How could he not recognize what was going on? And in his voluminous correspondence, he included this particular sentence expressing his irritation at the tactics and strategy of the revolutionaries in Venezuela, just waiting for his men to die. This was the principal leader of the revolutionaries in Venezuela. There were many of them, but this guy, Bolivar, who liked to be called El Libertador, I think, like Toussaint, understood differential resistance to disease and used it to his advantage in the campaigns that he fought. In his 20 volumes of collected correspondence, he included this one useful sentence, useful for me. I'm sure the others were useful for him. And by the way, for those of you contemplating doing historical research, I did this by skimming his 20 volumes of correspondence. Now you don't have to do that. You can just type in some useful keywords in a searchable database of Bolivar's writings. If I only waited a few years longer, I could have saved myself a lot of effort. At any rate, there is this useful sentence, which I'm going to read to you. We must lament the infinite sickness that has considerably reduced our troops, but we're consoled by the fact that the enemy must suffer greater losses, greater than infinity. That is impossible. He was no mathematician, although he was a really smart and well-educated guy. Partly because of the nature of his soldiers and partly because of the positions he occupies. So the nature of his soldiers, he was referring, without understanding the mechanics of it, to differential resistance to the immune systems of the Spanish army versus his own locally born and raised army. And the positions that he occupies, he's referring here to the parts of the country that were more disease infested or less disease infested, and his strategy was to keep the Spanish on the coasts or lure them into the llanos, where they would get sick. And he noticed, by the way, that he needed to recruit men from lowland areas. Recruiting men from highland areas where it's cooler and there are almost no mosquitoes and no malaria, no yellow fever, didn't work. They just died when they got to Venezuela, just like the Spaniards. Last case, and I'll go through this really fast because it's the same old story, which raises some questions about learning over time. Cuba, War of Independence in the 1890s. This guy, Valeriano Weyler, who won the biggest lottery in Spain. He was a multi-gazillionaire, and he's still elected to command the Spanish army in Cuba. He invented, or helped to invent, concentration camps, which was a brutal but reasonably effective strategy in the early years of the war. But it roused additional hostility on the part of the Cuban population, lending strength to the insurgency, as I suppose we should call it, led by, above all else, these two guys, Antonio Maceo and Maximo Gomez. And they fought a guerrilla campaign. Eventually, the Spanish gave up. And Gomez, in his not-so-voluminous correspondence, thank heavens, but he did write a memoir in which he said that he had 3 invincible generals in his campaign. June, July, and August. Once again, he's referring to the rainy season, the mosquito season, the yellow fever season. And here's some of the numbers in the bottom left. You can see what happened to the Spanish army. 200,000 people served, 900,000 were in hospital. That means each person was in an average of 4.5 times in his stay on the island of Cuba. And again, disease deaths outnumbered combat deaths by more than 1 order of magnitude. After 1898, as you probably know, the United States intervened in this war, and the U.S. Army pioneered yellow fever research there, and by 1900, 1901, they figured out what mosquito was responsible for yellow fever. It turns out that Aedes aegypti, because it's so weird in its breeding habits, is the world's easiest mosquito to control. That's great. We should all be thankful for that. You can put one tiny drop of kerosene in a well of water, and the mosquitoes can't breed in it. So it's really easy to control Aedes populations. And that, from that point on, yellow fever became increasingly easy to control. The vaccination that I spoke about seems hours ago to you. That came in 1933. So yellow fever has been, in most parts of the world, a trivial disease since that time, with no political importance whatsoever, anywhere. Part of the reason there's no research being done on it outside of one underfunded institute in Brazil. So what I've presented to you is sometimes, by my closest friends, referred to as mosquito determinism, which makes me the only mosquito determinist historian ever. And I embrace this good-naturedly, but I want to point out that it has limits. And what I've explored with you is not just mosquito determinism, because lots of things had to come together in particular ways for these stories to work out as they did. You had to have the increased hospitability to mosquitoes that came with the plantation economies in the Caribbean and in the South Carolina Low Country to make this work. You had to have the various wars of revolution led by people who made the choices that they did. British had to choose the Southern strategy. Toussaint had to choose his guerrilla strategy and, I think, know what he was doing with respect to differential immunity to conduct his war the way that he did. So, as I put it here, mosquitoes, and I'm paraphrasing the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, one of Karl Marx's inflammatory pamphlets, in which he said, "Men make history, but they do not make it just as they please." So mosquitoes too make history, but they're not doing it just as they please. They're doing it in concert with lots of other variables, social, cultural, political variables, human variables, but they're all working in complex interactions to produce the outcomes that I've described. So, a couple of lingering issues that I will leave you with. Retrospective diagnosis is a problem, much more so with malaria. Sometimes I don't really know what diseases are being reported in the sources. Sometimes I think I do know. I haven't said a word about treatment of these diseases. Said a little bit about preventive approaches. The bottom line with respect to medicine is there's nothing anybody could do that made much of a difference. And there's some all interesting issues about climate change and El Nino events that I might have gone into, but I didn't, lest I overtax your patience this afternoon. So, at the center of the story, mosquitoes, around the edges, great heroes. Thank you for your patience. And now, any and all questions, quibbles, quarrels that you might have, I will attempt to address. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. You somehow ended up, though, in a room with one of the few historians or historical geographers who's interested in Aedes aegypti, so sorry about that. They might be in Baltimore. But I'm wondering, and I actually will have to rush out for a bus, so I'm not storming out in anger at your answer. But in 1793 in Philadelphia, people were very afraid when they saw the black vomit. They knew what this was, they fled. And you haven't said a whole lot about how soldiers responded to seeing that black vomit. Was it harder, you think, for some of these folks to control their soldiers when black vomit was in the mix?
There's an easy answer to that, and it is yes. and flight was the normal informed response to any outbreak of yellow fever. But the stories that I'm telling take place mainly in social contexts of armies and slavery. That is, populations for which flight was difficult. But in the case of all these armies, whenever there was a yellow fever outbreak, they suffered, well, I wasn't going to say they suffered higher rates of desertion. That's probably not necessarily true. They experienced higher urges to desertion, which sometimes translated into higher rates of desertion, but if carefully policed, then desertion was impossible for ordinary soldiers to achieve. They were in effect held prisoner by their officers and at the mercy of yellow fever. So it's important that these events took place in the social contexts that they did. Had they been free individuals, they would have fled like the population of Philadelphia in the summer of 1793. Or the population of Baltimore from time to time at the end of the 18th century and the very beginning of the 19th. Because the mosquito used to come to these shores every summer from the Caribbean. You know that Domino sugar factory in the harbor? Well, that used to import, maybe not that building, but its predecessor, a lot of sugar from the West Indies. And when ships came from the West Indies, Aedes came too. And so in the summertime, you'd have vectors for yellow fever on the loose in Baltimore. They might or might not be infected. Sometimes they were, and there were frequent outbreaks in the city, around the port usually.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this talk. I've had the privilege to also read your book based on this, so I think I'm responding to some of that as well as the talk. But there's a British medical historian, Mark Harrison, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, who's now uncovering these cases of British naval doctors who are studying yellow fever in particular and malaria as early as the 1780s. He's arguing, he's got better evidence for 1790s onward. And he's arguing that the people on the ground are very aware of what's going on. You're right, they may not have the medicine to be able to combat it, but they know that their troops are going to die. The British know this. So my question is, you know, I like this idea of the mosquito determinism, but the kind of the idea of imperial determinism, that you have these bureaucrats back home in Europe who are sending their troops knowing they're going to die. The British know you know, there's going to be volumes of men dying. And yet they still do it, you know, so it's not like they would have changed their mind even if they knew that disease was going to confront them. And so therefore, how much does disease determine the situation in these revolutions if imperial nations are just willing to send mosquito fodder, you know, to the Caribbean? So I just wonder if, I'd love to hear your response to
Okay.
that.
Well, one of the interesting things, as I see it in this story, is their continued willingness to send young men to very high probability of their deaths. And the only explanation I have for that is after about 1750, when the knowledge of the likely outcomes became widespread, is that this represents the social distance between the decision makers and the mosquito fodder. And if 10,000 or 20,000 guys were going to die in 2 months from yellow fever, the decision makers could live with it. And this, to some extent, you don't get to be a decision maker in a military bureaucracy if you don't have a certain tolerance for sending young men to high probabilities of their deaths. You have to have a callousness, and you can't be sentimental about young men if you're going to make it in organizations like this. I do think that the mosquitoes were consequential because the outcomes of these campaigns, I think, would have been substantially different if it weren't for the tremendous mortality of the attacking expeditions in all these stories. So if, for example, in the case of the Haitian Revolution, if those 60,000 French soldiers had been healthy, how would the Haitian Revolution have turned out? We can't know for sure. But there's, I think, good reason to imagine that they would have been able to impose, through force of arms, an order on Saint-Domingue that would have allowed the reconstitution of the colonial regime. It would have had to look a little bit different. They would have had to make some tactical alliances with various of the social groups in Saint-Domingue. Or some of these other cases, you know, if you had not had the British Army sick in South Carolina and Yorktown, could that Southern strategy have succeeded? What would have happened? We don't know. I can imagine, however, that South Carolina and Georgia might have stayed in the British Empire the way Canada did, and the West Indies did, and that the United States would have been smaller. So we can't know, but my belief is that the mosquitoes and the diseases and the differential mortality did matter because they affected the outcomes of these campaigns.
Could I follow up on that?
Yes, since you're the director of the center that invited me, I guess, how can I refuse?
Do you have any evidence that the Europeans recognized there was this differential? In other words, I mean, it seems to me you're showing that the locals recognized it, or at least you've got a couple of examples that imply they do. But any sense that the British or the French recognized it?
Yes. By the 1740s, clearly, there's lots of correspondence in the military circles, naval circles especially, that say, if we're going to go there, we can't do it in the rainy season. We've got to conduct our business in the dry season. Unfortunately, there's the hurricane season they had to deal with as well. So that ruled out the autumn, because you don't want to lose your entire navy in an afternoon. So they didn't like to have naval expeditions there until December. And December through May is okay. And that's what they tried to do. But getting it all organized and getting across the ocean on time was usually too much. And any of you who have functioned within large bureaucracies can appreciate this problem. And they were often exactly 6 months late, which is the worst possible timing. They should have waited another 6 months, but that's not the way military strategy is conducted. So while there's some ignorance about the likely consequences of yellow fever in the campaigns of the 1690s and in the first part of the 18th century, by the 1740s, everybody who knows anything about the West Indies knows this, whether they live there or whether they live in London or Paris. There's no longer ignorance. And in fact, I'm convinced myself, I may be the only person so convinced, that the Spanish began to organize their imperial defense with this understanding, and to build more fortifications, rely less upon their navy, because fortifications meant sieges. Sieges meant weeks or months exposed to the hazards of the climate, as they put it in the 18th century, meaning the disease climate.
But did they recognize the differential between the different groups of people?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. They recognized a number of differentials. One that they wrote about frequently was Europeans versus Africans, which is not precise, because it's not actually Africans in general who are more resistant to malaria and yellow fever. It's people born and raised in certain environments, which include West and West Central Africa, and also Angola. But nonetheless, that fine point was lost on them, and they put it in terms of Europeans and Africans. They also recognized the difference between newcomers to the West Indies and old hands, and the different vulnerabilities of these populations. And as I said, they probably imagined another differential between males and females. Yeah.
We do have probable medical knowledge that people
answered the last two questions beginning with the word yes. This one I'm going to begin with the word maybe. I talked to some medical people and biologists about this. I even talked to a super duper famous one, Jared Diamond, about this. And what he said was, and this is a reasonably accurate quotation, it is inconceivable that people whose ancestors were exposed to the risk of yellow fever generation after generation would not evolve some sort of resistance to it, because it's such a dangerous disease. It exercises a brutal selection pressure upon populations. So from the point of view of people trained in biology, it's hard to imagine that over time this would not produce some sort of resistance, and the genetic basis of that resistance would spread very rapidly within populations. That is what one would expect. And my personal guess is that that probably did happen, and that people whose ancestors for generations had lived in endemic yellow fever zones did have some heritable resistance to it. But it's a sensitive issue, and some people find it objectionable because they get confused and think it's an issue between black and white, and therefore it is misunderstood to represent a different racial susceptibility or resistance. And that's, of course, a political hot potato. It is, as I've said twice now, actually not anything to do with race, not anything to do with Africanness. Generally, it's specific geographical environmental zones in which one's ancestors did or did not live that would account for this if it exists. And my guess is that it does exist, but I don't know.
How did the viruses alone influence public opinion about the affluent versus simple colonists in the Americas?
Wait a minute. Affluent versus simple colonists?
Versus rich versus poor, sort of
Uh-huh.
demographic.
Okay, this is another social variable that I haven't said anything about, and the 17th and 18th century sources don't either. And there's a reason for that, which is that the morbidity and mortality rates amongst rich and poor were really similar. And that's not the case in some diseases. Some infections that are related to, the severity of which are related to nutrition, for example, will show big differences that correspond to social class. People who are better fed are more resistant. In the case of yellow fever, it's not true. And in the case of malaria, if it is true, it's a comparatively weak effect. Now, there is one other consideration in which social class is relevant, and that is the ability to flee. And I've touched a little bit upon this earlier, in the sense of people who were not at liberty to flee, but there are also people who can't flee because they're poor, and people who are rich can flee. So for example, in South Carolina, before the American Revolution started, rich people routinely left the Low Country in the summer months. And they did this explicitly, they wrote about it all the time, to avoid the fever season. If they lived in Charleston, they were trying to avoid yellow fever, which would come to Charleston maybe 1 out of 6, 1 out of 10 years. And if they lived in the countryside on a plantation, they were doing it to avoid the country fever, as they called it sometimes, or ague, which means malaria. And if they were really rich, they'd go to Rhode Island, to Newport. But if they weren't all that rich, they might go up country into the Piedmont and substantially lower their risk of exposure. Poor people did not have this option available to them. So there's some greater exposure risk in some situations. You don't see much of this in the case of the West Indies. You see it much more powerfully in South Carolina. Yes?
Could I
ask you to, as a last question perhaps, before we go to the reception, talk a little bit about what this new book is about, the one whose title I had to look up on Wikipedia.
The new book is, I think, called A Brief History of the Anthropocene, or Anthropocene, depending on how you pronounce it. It's a new term, probably coined by the Dutch atmospheric chemist, Paul Crutzen. And so just how we're supposed to pronounce it is unclear. It'll sort itself out eventually if the term becomes generally used. And to remind you, Dr. Kars explained this earlier, what it refers to is a new geological era in the history of the Earth in which the human species is the most important variable in promoting environmental change. And that is an idea that I and some others have adopted, and most of the people who have adopted it are environmental scientists or geologists. And the term is explicitly a geological one, and it's intended to follow the Holocene. Geologists say we're in the Holocene, we've been in the Holocene for 10,000 years, before that was the Pleistocene. And those who believe it now say we're actually in the Anthropocene. And what I wrote about in this book is the validity or invalidity of the idea, and I come down in favor of validity. If we are then in the Anthropocene, how long have we been in it? And I argue in this book for two stages. An early stage in the Anthropocene that goes back to maybe 1800, to the adoption of fossil fuels, primarily in England, and the beginning of progressive loading of the atmosphere with additional carbon dioxide and other pollutants derived from the combustion of coal. But then after 1950 or so, a much accelerated phase of the Anthropocene, in which on 10 measures, 20 measures, 50 measures, you see a powerful imprint of the human species all over the place, not just the atmosphere. And so, as I see it, we've been in the Anthropocene in a general loose sense for 200 or more years. We've been in a more intense phase of the Anthropocene for 50 or 60 years. And documenting that, trying to make that a convincing case, is what that book is about. And it's done, although I keep having to revise it. I finished the draft before the Fukushima disaster in Japan. So, geez, I've got to get that in there. So I found a suitable place, put in a couple of pages about Fukushima. And I live in fear of the next powerful, persuasive piece of evidence that the Anthropocene is upon us, which will oblige me to revise my text yet again.
So it may never be finished.
I should probably do it instead as, rather than a printed, published book, I should do it as a website, so in the middle of the night I can update it, and it'll be fresh every morning.
Well, thank you so very much, John.